We are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now is Dean Baker, who we always look forward to speaking with. Dean is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. He is an economist who makes sense. He is author of books like The Conservative Nanny State, How the Wealthy Use the Government to stay rich and get richer, and The End of Loser Liberalism. Dean, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So listen, there are a couple things I'd love to talk to you about, but I guess the big one that everybody's talking about in the economics world right now is the fact that the deficit is down. All we heard for years was how the deficit was creating, you'd have thought it was an existential crisis to Western civilization, but now it's down. Why aren't the deficit hawks, so-called, who are pushing this issue so much, celebrating?
Well, I'm speculating. We're all speculating what their motives are. But, the whole thing, we're supposed to worry that the deficit was going through the roof. It was going to create panic in financial markets, meaning interest rates would soar. We would see soaring inflation, and the risk of economic collapse. And this hasn't happened. And, of course, the deficit is now to, a relatively modest level. It's about 2.5% of GDP. The debt-to-GDP ratio is falling. If that was really their concern, they should be celebrating. But, I refer to a piece Fred Hyatt was in, the Washington Post editorial page editor. He's outraged that Obama was, saying, oh, we got the deficit down, it's under control. And, I think this speaks, their real agenda wasn't about the deficit. They have two agendas here. One is they want to see cutbacks to Social Security and Medicare, and, that's clearly an end in itself. Obviously, these programs cost money. That's not a secret, but they're incredibly important programs to the vast majority of working people in this country. They depend on them. So their issue is they want to cut those programs, and the reality is, they cost money, but the reality is we can afford them. The other point is I think they like this as a distraction. The real story, you look at the economy, you look at the country, the real story is all this money is being redistributed upward. Workers have seen little or none of the benefits of economic growth over the last 3 decades. And I wish I could say that was about to change, and it may well not. We may see another, 3 decades where all the gains from growth go to the top 1%. That's what I think people are concerned about. But rather than focusing on the issue across classes, they're trying to make this into an age issue. Oh, my God, our grandparents, our parents, they're running off, they're living high on the hog with their Medicare and Social Security. They say this stuff. And, when you go, well, wait, the deficit isn't a problem, that undermines their case. So they don't have anything to distract us, so now we're going to start worrying about all the money going up rather than the money that our parents are getting.
See, here's the part that I don't get, and I maybe it's not fair to ask you. Maybe I need a psychologist rather than an economist to answer these kinds of questions. But I guess what strikes me is, number one, they've been wrong in their predictions. Number two, there doesn't seem to be any evidence to suggest there's consistency in their arguments. But I doubt that anybody gets up or that very many people get up in the morning and say, I'm going to stick it to old people right now or whatever. So they must have some inner story they tell themselves that they seem genuinely outraged. I mean, when you wrote about Fred Hyatt's piece and reading Fred Hyatt's piece in the Washington Post, he did seem angry. These people do seem indignant sometimes. How does one, and again, may not be fair to ask you since you're not a psychologist, but I just wonder, and you'd be speculating too, but how does one get that detached from what the rest of us might think of as objective reality?
I think a couple things, and yeah, I think they have internalized this. So I don't think, I guess I've met Fred Hyatt once or twice. I've met a lot of the people that do work on these issues, and I know some of them, and I don't think most of them are sitting around there, how could we kick grandma, But, they've really internalized this, that this is something wrong. So I think they in their view, government is, they might even, some of these people are actually reasonably liberal and saying, look, they want to help poor people. They believe that we should give poor kids a chance with a decent education, Head Start, health care. I know a lot of these people would say yes to all those things. But the idea is that that's really going to be the exception. So the idea that we're running a healthcare system through the government, Medicare, and now, with the Affordable Care Act, the exchanges, that really just isn't right to them. And with Social Security. They're going, people are making 100,000 a year. They're going to get 20,000 a year from the government, and that really, I've had people say this to me, like, this is an outrage. And you go, well, they paid for that. But the
Right.
idea that you have a program, a retirement program that's run through the government. I remember I was on a panel once with one of these people. I'm not going to say his name because I actually have a lot of respect for him. But he was just appalled that, you could have people with six-figure incomes that are going to be getting, over 20,000 a year from the government. And I said to him, well, if we had privatized Social Security, so they paid that into a private account, they were getting that money, you wouldn't bat an eye. And he had to admit that.
Right.
So because we're running through the government, somehow, obviously someone earning 100,000 a year, they're relatively well to do, but they're not rich. But somehow that they're getting that money, that's just an outrage.
Well, that's such a huge piece of it, and it seems to extend to Medicare as well, and the idea that somebody might get medical treatment, whether it's social insurance like Social Security or Medicare. I mean, the analogy, that's a great analogy, but or a great way to explain it by saying if it had been privatized, they wouldn't be upset. They're not upset when they get returns on investments or whatever.
No, you could point to, one of the things I like to point to, Pete Peterson, who funds a lot of this stuff. I don't know his portfolio, but I'd be surprised if he doesn't have a lot of government bonds. He probably has at least 10, 20, he might have $100 million worth of government bonds, which means he could well get, $3 million a year in interest. And you go, well, isn't that an outrage? Here's this very wealthy person. He's getting a check for the government every year, $3 million. And they'd look at me like that's nuts. Well, of course he paid for that. And I go, and they paid for Social Security, and they paid for Medicare.
Right. And the other analogy, those are great points to make. And the analogy that I like to use, if it is a proper analogy, is the insurance aspect of this. That nobody's outraged if a guy broadsides me in my car and I get $50,000 in medical bills and in repair bills. Nobody says, well, wait a minute, how much do you make? Well, I think maybe you make too much to get a free check for $50,000. They say the guy paid his insurance for a few years. Then he had an accident. He filed a claim. He got money for it. That's how it works, right? So that's the insurance side of it. Aren't you
Exactly.
supposed to, when you qualify, when you have a qualifying event, whether it's retirement or illness or disability or whatever, isn't the insurance supposed to pay you?
That's exactly right. And, this is where the public, I would say broad public, not that they study the programs, but I think that they know the details and, people can give you the ins and outs of, the payback schedules and everything from Social Security. But they have a sense of what this is and why it's fair. And that's why, I think most people, when they hear, you could have a rich person even, and, they're going to get their 20,000, 25,000 a year from Social Security. Most part, they paid into it. So people go, okay, it's structured to have a progressive payback, and that's part of the insurance aspect. If you've been earning $150,000 a year your whole life, you could get by with a lower payback. So your payback in retirement is going to be somewhere around 20-25% of what you earned during your working lifetime. Whereas if you earned, let's say an average of 15-20,000 a year, your payback's going to be around 70-75%. That's part of the insurance aspect. So, the guy who's been earning, 100-150,000, they're going to get more than the person earning, 15 or 20,000, but it's going to be nowhere proportionate to what they paid into it. Again, that's the logic of insurance. They don't need it as much.
Right. And I guess the question is also, I think about the involvement of people. You mentioned somebody that you didn't want to mention because you respect them a lot. There are people that I also respect, although I don't travel in quite the same world, but I know some of the folks. But it makes me think of, and I wonder what you think of this. I can't remember now the name of the political scientist who wrote in the 70s or 80s that the media, I think he was half right and half wrong, but his quote was, the media can't tell people what to think, but it can tell them what to think about. And I think he's part right, part wrong, but an interesting thought. And I wonder if that isn't true to a certain extent about policy advisors and economists and other people who work in this field. And that if you say to people over and over again, well, we have to figure out the 75-year unfunded liability of Social Security, which is, or the portion which might be unfunded, and how to cut benefits to address it. If you say that over and over again, are they maybe just going to fix their minds on that problem? Yeah, how can you cut benefits in a humane way and stop thinking about the big picture, which is, the other driving forces, wage inequality and maybe a payroll cap, a tax cap, and all that. Is it just a kind of where people's minds get hijacked by repetition, you think?
Oh, exactly. I don't know how many times I've seen, reporters asking a politician going, well, what's your solution to Social Security? Like you have to have this. You go, well, what's your solution for wage stagnation? That doesn't come up. But, I remember Tim Russert, who unfortunately died. I mean, I don't want to see anyone die young, which he did, of course, and that was unfortunate. But, he had this reputation as a tough questioner. I don't want you to meet the press that often, but I mean, I recall his tough questions going, well, what's your solution to Social Security? Like, why should you have one? This is a distant problem. I mean, that's fine. If you want to sit down and go, oh, we could do it this way, we could do it that. But the reality is we don't have to do anything with it. We have a current problem. Let's just talk about the moment. We have a current problem of millions of people who'd like to work who can't get jobs, millions of more who would like full-time jobs but only have part-time work, and then tens of millions who aren't in a position to see their wages grow, haven't seen any wage increase in years. These are very real and immediate problems. So then you ask people a tough question. What's your solution? Social Security. It's going to, face a shortfall in 20 years.
Right.
Okay, we could think about that, but that doesn't seem the most important issue.
No, the other thing that always struck me about this is about that question in particular, that Social Security would have a shortfall of 25% in 25 years or whatever, is, but wait a minute, it's got 25 years where it's 100% funded, even if we do nothing. Every other government program I can think of has only a year, and then it has to have more funding authorized. So isn't it 20 times better off? Am I a naive question? I know,
Well,
but
it's a little hard to compare because the other programs, as a practical matter, they come out of the general budget, whereas this does
right.
have a designated stream of funding. But important thing to keep in mind, and here again, I think incredible misrepresentations. They like to throw big numbers, trillions of dollars, which is a big number. None of us will ever see that. Even Bill Gates won't see trillions of dollars. But if you want to be serious, you talk about relative to the size of the economy. People always go, "You're trying to minimize the problem." I go, "No, I'm trying to put it in a way people could understand it because no one understands trillions of dollars." And we're talking about shortfalls on the order of, 6/10, 7th, 8/10 of 1% of GDP. Is that big? It's not trivial. We increased defense spending on the order of 2 percentage points of GDP when we started the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Again, I won't say it was trivial, but I can't say that wrecked the economy. And another comparison, if we look at the shortfall we're projecting for Social Security, 20 years out, it's comparable to what we faced in the 80s. And I used to go around. I don't ask anymore because it's too far in the past. But back in the '90s, I used to go around and begin a talk. I go, "Can anyone tell me bad things that happened in the 1980s?" And people would usually mention their team lost the Super Bowl, or some might talk about the space shuttle exploding, the tragedy like that. Never once in dozens of talks, talking to thousands of people, never once did I have anyone mention the tax increases we had in the 1980s to pay for Social Security.
Which is a great point, and I want to get back to that. We're going to take. You also mentioned Bill Gates. I want to get back to that. I have a question for you about that, but we're going to take a very quick break. We'll be right back after this with more from Economist Dean Baker. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour with the Economist Dean Baker, trying to make sense of the mad beltway world we live in and the mad economy we live in. And Dean, we were talking about Social Security before we went out, but we were also talking, you just mentioned in passing Bill Gates, how even Bill Gates won't see trillions of dollars. Well, did you happen to see the editorial or blog post that Bill Gates wrote this week?
I saw it. In fact, I wrote a short op-ed on it in Al Jazeera America because I couldn't resist. Someone sent it to me. I go, "Oh, this is too delicious." The richest person in the world commenting on Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, which is about concentration of wealth among the rich. So, so of course I did see it and I commented on it.
I'm sorry, I didn't see the comments. I've got to. I forget you're on Al Jazeera too, but I wanted to ask what you thought. But I particularly wanted to ask. I don't know if you commented on the part where he said, "Isn't there something we all agree inequality is bad, yada yada yada. But don't you think? I felt this was his conscience speaking. Don't you think there's something better about somebody who's got a lot of money and devotes it to good things, as I do, as opposed to someone who's got a lot of money and just keeps it? And I thought, it's actually kind of an interesting question. To what extent does one mitigate the harm if you're Bill Gates, caused by your own fortune and the system that allows that massive accumulation of wealth, by giving it away to what you deem to be worthy projects? It's a provocative and interesting point, and I have opinions, but I'm more interested in yours.
Well, let me get to a prior point, because this is one of the main things in my piece. I don't. If someone gets incredibly wealthy by having a great innovation that made all our lives hugely better, that's one thing. That's almost never the case, and it's certainly not the case with Bill Gates. Bill Gates got incredibly wealthy because the Justice Department went to sleep and said all the sort of classic antitrust practices that John D. Rockefeller did back 100 years ago with Standard Oil, that was okay because this is the new economy and we don't believe in antitrust law, so monopolies are fine. That's how he got incredibly rich. It wasn't that Windows is such a great operating system. It isn't. No one was a user. No one I know who does software. I'm not on the inside guy, but I do know people who are. I don't know anyone who ever said that's a good system. So he didn't contribute some great thing to the world. He prevented software development. He didn't promote it. And, we can go through the list of Fortune 500 or 400 richest people. I think we'd find that for most of them. But getting to the issue of his philanthropy is not neutral. I once had an occasion to talk to a program officer from the Gates Foundation because we were interested in doing some work on the drug development and looking at alternatives to patents. So, we had outlined a proposal, and I was talking with this woman, and I said something about patents, and she said, "We don't talk about patents." And I said, "Excuse me?" And she said, "Well, because of our founder, obviously Bill Gates, Microsoft depends patents and copyrights." And so, I was just sort of taken aback. Oh, okay. Well, one of the things that Bill Gates has done is talked about getting drugs to poor people in the developing world, getting expensive drugs to them. The reason drugs are expensive is because patent protection. Now, I understand, that's the way we give people incentive to innovate, to develop new drugs. But that's not the only way. That is not the way we have to do it. And that was exactly what I wanted to analyze. What other ways? We do spend $30 billion a year funding research at the National Institutes of Health. So we do understand, and there's widespread agreement, that's money well spent. Even the drug industry says that's money very well spent. We do understand that we can get people to do good research without patent protection. Those people aren't relying on patent protection. They're getting checks from the government. So the question is, can we find a better way? And I would argue it'd be hard to find a worse way than our system of patent support for financing drug research. But Bill Gates, at least, is not going to do that. And, I have some evidence he actually has actively tried to obstruct alternatives. And, if he makes, as I wrote in my piece, it's good if he, makes it easier for people in the developing world to buy expensive drugs, but it would be even better if they weren't expensive to begin with.
Right, and this gets to part of my point, not my entire point about the philanthropist, but about the billionaire philanthropist, which is, aren't we in danger of running into a situation where mega philanthropies, whether they're the Gates Foundation or Susan G. Komen Foundation, which is not one person but has created, can't there be such a thing as a philanthropic monopoly that that in effect has undue control over certain aspects of our nonprofit economy? And your example kind of points to that, and perhaps leads it in directions that aren't productive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one example. Someone who runs a nonprofit, I could tell you we would have a lot easier time getting money if we argued different things. Picking on Bill Gates again, I mean, another area that he spent a lot of his money is on so-called education reform. And to a large extent, this is a union-busting movement. This is about pushing aside teachers' unions, saying the big obstacle to better education in inner cities are these damn unions that are trying to, ensure that teachers get decent pay, benefits, and can't be fired arbitrarily. And Bill Gates was supporting a lot of work saying that no, we have to go after these people. And I think he has gotten a little better. He's written some things that are a little more sophisticated recently, and I think they're moving away from that. I'm not sure. I don't follow it that closely, but that's exactly the sort of thing. I mean, I think teacher unions are on the whole good things. Sure, sometimes some teacher unions are corrupt, no doubt about it. Every institution has their bad apples, but in general, that's a good thing. If you want to talk about improving the quality of education, to my view, that means working with the teachers' unions, not trying to beat them up.
Right. And getting a decent wage for teachers so that talented people see that as a profession they can actually go into again. And by the way, the other example in education, I guess, and I'm sure you followed this too, was Mark Zuckerberg's dropping a big chunk of money into the Newark school system without much supervision. And the famous quote from one of the city council members there was, "Everybody got paid and Raheem still can't read." But in that case, it was more I would say randomized. I don't know that it had any specific goal in mind, but I guess I'm a little more concerned about what you described, which is the Gates Foundation or anyone altering the debate about education reform, or a very large politically connected foundation like Susan G. Komen initially deciding not to work with Planned Parenthood, one of the best organizations to work on those issues, for political reasons or whatever it might be. And I guess the other piece I would say is what Gates was really, I think, trying to get at with that comment was, hasn't he kind of expiated the sin of accumulating all this money to what extent, to the extent that he recognizes it causes social harm, by using it wisely? And I think one piece is how he uses it, whether that's monopolistic, but I think the other piece is, is there a way to calculate the social or overall economic impact of a Bill Gates becoming a billionaire so that we know just exactly how much good he'd have to do to come out even?
Well, I think whatever we did would be very arbitrary, because again, a lot would depend on whether we think him becoming a billionaire was due to him having a great innovation, that he produced this great operating system, or the software that we use for word processing software, or Excel as a spreadsheet or whatever. That he had great innovation, so now we have this software that we would not have otherwise. Then that's a net positive. On the other hand, if he basically used anti-competitive practices to prevent software development, prevent better systems from being used, well, that's a huge negative. And I don't know how much he's going to have to give away, probably 2 or 3 times his fortune, because that costs us a huge amount in terms of economic growth, economic development, that we're sitting here with clunky software. I mean, for my part, the Excel that I use today isn't as good as the Lotus 123 that I used back in 1992. Software is not supposed to get worse, but you give me the option of getting that software today versus the Excel, take it in a second.
When I was a financial analyst for AIG, I used to use Lotus 123, and I was pretty good at programming the macros too. So I would have to agree with you on that, but that's a trip down memory lane. I guess the other piece of it, by the way, with Gates personally, is just, I'm sure he may be a fine man, I'm sure in many ways, but his parents knew people at IBM, which is how he got the contract in the first place. So I think the social stratification dimension of it gets overlooked, but it gets to an interesting question, which is, okay, someone comes up with an innovative internet product, and again, as you say, I'm sure you're right, it's arbitrary, but let's take Airbnb, okay, and leaving aside all the issues whether Airbnb is allowing people to illegally operate hotels, which is what Eric Schneiderman, the Attorney General of New York, calls them in his current actions. I think there's truth to that. But leaving that all aside, I mean, if you look at the valuation of an Uber, for example, which is enormous, I guess we get into the idea of, it seems to me that the valuations are way out of whack, and that if you're a smart guy who has a good idea for connecting people who want to uh, do X with people who want X done for them, and you design a nice app, that somehow that should be something that makes you well off. I have no objection to that. A millionaire, great. But should it really give you a market valuation that's greater than most physical manufacturers in the country? Or,
Yeah, yeah.
what's,
Well, I think there's two separate issues here. One is, how great are these innovations? Are they really that great? Is Airbnb, bottom line, I think it currently has a market capitalization of something like 17 billion. If most of it's private, but if you were to impute the shares
Right.
that have, it would be somewhere around that order. So the question is, does it really have a market value of that magnitude? I don't know the answer to that, but I'll just point out their past examples. AOL back in 2000, the peak of the bubble, had a market
Right.
cap of around 250 billion, and these guys managed to cash out. Steve Case, of course, being the biggest one, he managed to cash out by basically getting Time Warner, I think it was at the time the largest media company in the world, to sell itself for nothing. They sold itself to AOL for their shares. Well, their shares collapsed. So you had, this huge, long-standing company basically gave itself away to AOL. So these guys got incredibly wealthy, not because they had something that actually had that value. AOL, of course, didn't ultimately prove to be worth anywhere near that much, but they were able to get out before people caught on, and they ended up being incredibly rich. Is that justified? Well, that's kind of a scam deal. That's unfortunate, and the AOL, the owners of Time Warner stock were the big losers. Second question is, okay, let's for the moment assume that's right. Assume that the Airbnb will be worth 17 billion or whatever it is. Create something of that great value. Have to ask, what did they do? What is that? Is that because they have this great innovation? Is that because they were able to, in some way, monopolize the market? Or, I know you didn't want to go into this. Is that because basically they're skirting the laws? They're, found ways to get around regulations, avoid taxes on, hotel occupancy and all these other things. Insofar as it's the latter, insofar as it's, basically they're gaming the system, it's pretty hard to see how you justify that. But if this is just this really great breakthrough, I may not like to see it, but, that what that would be saying is they've created something of enormous value, well, might be inclined to say it's okay. But as a reality, I think that is almost never true. And
And it
every case
seems
that I've seen, it turns out, on closer inspection, it has not been true.
And it seems as if every one of these, not everyone, but it seems as if that's the common thread in a lot of these hyper valued companies. And by the way, when you were talking about America Online, I was thinking I should have named my first blog Digital Tulips, because, I've been trying to, you know what I'm referring to,
Yeah,
but for our
yeah.
listeners, try the tulip craze of 1637 and so on. The idea that, but, I guess it seems to me the model is whether you're Facebook, whether you're Microsoft, whether you're Google, which, by the way, I think is probably the technically most proficient of the bunch, but Uber, Airbnb, that it seems now to be an accepted part of the model to break or bend laws, rules, whatever, to just get to that monopolistic market share as quickly as you can. And that seems to me to be the core piece of evaluation. Am I reading that wrong, or you think that's sort of right?
Well, that's certainly how I'd see it. And again, you go down the list of companies, you go, okay, Airbnb, what is this? Well, we've had bed and breakfasts. That's not new. We have
Right.
Craigslist. That's not new. So what exactly is new here? And to a large extent, it's, getting around regulations, getting around the laws and saying, hey, we don't care. We're the internet. I've had people almost tell me that, well, this is new. It's a sharing economy. I go, I don't care if you call it Joe. I mean, it's, we're talking about a system where, we've had regulations of hotels and, fine, they might not be perfect, but, you don't get to escape them just because you do your reservations on the web.
Okay, I was trying to figure out where we go for the last part of this conversation, because there's so much we could talk about, but I guess the sharing economy is the place to go. This phrase that I hear over and over again, well, the answer to the future is, and I've written about, the economist Tyler Cowen, and I've written about Friedman ad nauseum. Uh, Look, I guess where I come down is, yeah, it's not really about, they don't get $17 billion valuation because they've created software that allows my neighbor to know that I would lend him my lawnmower. I mean, what we're really talking about is a covert economy to replace the current visible regulated one. This is me, yeah, but I'm interested in your thoughts, to replace the current visible one. And by the way, if you think this is going to rescue America, try making money off Airbnb in Milwaukee.
Yeah. Yeah. No, as I say, I have nothing against, I know, I have friends tell me, oh, you got to use Airbnb, this and that. That's fine. I have nothing against it. But again, the idea here is that we've set up rules, regulatory system that apply to hotels. If we're talking about Uber, apply to cabs, and it's hardly a perfect system. So fine, let's go back and examine those regulations, see where they're right, see where they're wrong, update them, modernize them for the 21st century. That's great, but you don't get to say, oh, those don't apply to me because we do this over the web. And Airbnb, it's a great example that, we have all these restrictions we put on hotels. They have to, meet safety regulations. They have occupancy taxes that, most city governments have. You don't like taxes, fine, but if you have a unionized hotel, you're paying the taxes. So you're doing Airbnb, you don't get out of that. And of course, there's a big issue. People in apartment buildings, condos, they're using Airbnb, basically turning them into hotels. Well, people weren't paying rent to live in a hotel. So that really does affect your neighbors. If you have people coming and going at all hours of the night, most people are expecting that they'd have a quiet neighbor, a reasonably quiet neighbor. A very different story if they're having all these people coming in and out all the time. So there's a lot of issues about Airbnb. Same thing with Uber. We have incredible regulations that apply to cabs. Probably too many. They have to have insurance. They have to go through all these. Drivers have to take special tests. They have to do background checks with the FBI, which all this they pay for. Safety inspections, again, maybe these are excessive. In many cases, they almost certainly are. But it doesn't make sense to say, okay, if you have a cab, you have to meet all these requirements, all these regulations. But, if you're Uber and people order you over the web, well, none of that applies. That doesn't make any sense.
No, it seems to me a mythologizing of the technology. And by the way, there are two houses in my neighborhood who rent themselves out for parties on Airbnb, and it's created some safety problems among other things. So I guess, and your dog emphatically agrees with me that it's the wrong way to go. And so I guess just to wrap it up, last word in like 60 seconds. I've written ad nauseum about Amazon and what ought to be done. Franklin Foer of the New Republic wrote, and I've actually quoted you in a piece that isn't published yet. But your thoughts, just briefly on what's been left out of the Amazon debate.
Well, I'd say first and foremost with Amazon, let's just get them to pay their taxes. This is one that just kind of drives me up the wall because, there's issues about are they acting as a monopolist in this and that market, and I think you have to look at that closely. I think most markets probably not, in fairness to them. But, the idea that, here you have brick and mortar stores, often family-owned businesses, small businesses, they have to pay sales tax. But in many states, it's still the case. Jeff Bezos is not paying his sales tax. And to my mind, that's just incredible. So again, this gets back to common regulations. I'm concerned about the antitrust issues, but I just said, let's start at the beginning. If we can't get this guy to pay sales tax, it'll be a long time before we get anywhere in the antitrust story.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And on the antitrust, I guess the only thing that people say, well, he's probably close to monopolistic on the ebooks and internet sale of books, but to overall physical books, he's not. Well, but there's a lot of overlap between these two markets, and I don't know what you would call it when he can exert undue pressure on pricing because of his near monopoly position in one form of distribution, but not another. But I still think he's a threat in that case. I guess I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, well, again, I look at it closely because you have to. I would be careful. I think they've done services in bringing down prices and they've made it easier for a lot of people to publish. We ended up publishing. I wrote a book recently with Jared Bernstein. I think we've talked about before that we end up publishing through Amazon. Because they did it very quickly and very cheaply. And I know there's Stephen King's going, oh, I'm not going to be able to get as much money for my book. Well, feel bad about that, Stephen, but the fact that I could get my book out quickly and get it available to a lot of people, that meant a lot to me.
Well, absolutely, and unfortunately, Dean, we're going to have to leave it there. But great discussion as always, and as always, I thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
You bet. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.